In the silent, dust-choked archives of Charleston, South Carolina, a secret lay buried for more than a century, sealed behind a wall of brick and mortar. The year was 1951, when workers, restoring the old county courthouse, broke through into a forgotten vault. Inside, a single iron box held the forbidden legacy of one of the city's most powerful families. This is the dark story of Amelia Hollingsworth, the heiress who in 1845 committed an act so unthinkable it threatened to shatter the very foundations of Charleston society. She kept a slave as her heir. The documents found that day, a will sealed with a blood-red crest and a woman's private diary, posed a question that history had tried to erase. What horrific truth led to the family's disappearance? And why was this macabre case so terrifying that it was deliberately buried, leaving behind only whispers of a crime that science itself could never explain? This is the case of Charleston's most sinister inheritance, a mystery of a family that vanished after challenging the cruelest laws of their time. The truth, hidden within these recovered pages, reveals a story of forbidden love, moral justice, and a final, horrific act of violence in the deep, unforgiving heart of antebellum America. What really happened inside the Hollingsworth mansion, and what dark secret was so powerful that it required a legacy of absolute silence? Welcome to Before the Store. If you value deep historical investigations that unearth the truths others have tried to bury, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and enable all notifications so you never miss an untold story. Please take a moment to like this video, as it helps us bring these forgotten cases into the light. And now, let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. The breaking of the red wax seal in 1951 was a quiet, almost ceremonial act, yet it unleashed a story that had been silenced for 106 years. The archivist present that day noted the crisp crackle of the aged paper, the scent of leather and decay rising from the iron box. Contained within were two artifacts that would become the cornerstones of this dark family mystery: the final will of Amelia Hollingsworth and her personal diary. These were not mere historical records. They were a testament to a profound moral rebellion that had taken place within the most rigid and unforgiving social structure in America. The will was a legal bomb, its contents an unprecedented inversion of the natural order as Charleston understood it. The diary, its pages filled with an elegant but increasingly troubled script, provided the only map into the heart of the woman who dared to write it. The narrative contained within these documents begins in the autumn of 1843. Amelia Hollingsworth, at 29 years old, had just become the sole mistress of one of Charleston's great fortunes. Her father, a titan of banking and a discreet but prolific slave trader, had passed, leaving her in command of a vast empire built on finance, shipping, and human flesh. The Hollingsworth mansion at 27 East Battery stood as a monument to this power, its grand columns and sprawling piazzas facing the harbor from which the family's wealth had sailed in. Society saw her as an heiress of immense standing, a prize in the city's intricate web of arranged marriages, but her own words from that time paint a far different picture, one of profound and suffocating dread. Her very first diary entry, dated October 17, 1843, sets a tone of spiritual crisis. She wrote, "My father is gone. I am now the sole mistress of his house, his fortune, and his sins. I do not know which weighs upon me more." This single sentence reveals a consciousness already fractured by the moral burden of her inheritance. She describes walking the halls of the mansion not as its owner, but as a ghost, haunting the scene of a crime she had only just begun to comprehend. The opulence of her surroundings, the gilded mirrors, the imported silks, the polished mahogany, no longer felt like a birthright, but like the physical manifestation of a deep ancestral corruption that now belonged entirely to her. Charleston in 1845 was a city built on sacred hierarchies of bloodline, race, and wealth. The aristocracy, a tight-knit clan of planter and merchant families, governed a world where lineage was paramount. To defy this order was not merely a social misstep, it was an act of heresy against the civic religion of the South. The Hollingsworth name was synonymous with this order, a pillar of the establishment that held the system in place. For Amelia to even question the foundation of her family's legacy was a silent internal act of treason, one that would inevitably lead her toward a confrontation with the world that had created her and now expected her to uphold its brutal traditions. The initial pages of her diary are filled with meticulous descriptions of her father's study, a room she had rarely entered as a child. She details the heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the Charleston sun, the shelves lined with leather-bound books on maritime law and commerce, the faint lingering smell of tobacco and brandy. It was in this masculine sanctum of power that she began her reluctant education in the mechanics of her inheritance. She was not preparing to lead the family empire, as a son would have, but to understand the assets she would one day pass to a suitable husband. But what she found in those ledgers was far more than a simple accounting of wealth. She spent her days sifting through shipping manifests, property deeds, and financial statements, the sheer scale of the Hollingsworth enterprise slowly revealing itself to her. Her entries from this period are detached, almost clinical, as if recording the details of a foreign and unsettling world. She notes the purchase of cotton fields in the upstate, the acquisition of shares in textile mills in England, and the financing of trade voyages to the Caribbean. It was a global network of capital and influence, all managed from this dark, silent room on East Battery. But beneath the surface of these legitimate transactions lay a deeper, more sinister current of commerce, one that was rarely spoken of aloud, but was understood to be the true source of Charleston's prosperity. The mystery of Amelia Hollingsworth is not simply what she did, but how she came to the decision to do it. The diary provides a chilling, intimate account of a moral awakening taking place in the heart of a system designed to prevent one. She was a product of her class, educated to be an ornament of society, to manage a household, and to produce heirs who would carry the family name. Nothing in her upbringing had prepared her for the truths she was about to unearth in her father's ledgers. She was utterly alone, an isolated woman in a world of powerful men, armed with nothing but a growing sense of horror and a pen. Her initial intention was simply to put her father's affairs in order, to fulfill her duty as the last of his direct line. She describes her methodical process, her desire to be diligent and honor his memory. But the documents she reviewed refused to remain silent artifacts of business. They began to speak to her, telling a story of calculated cruelty and profound human suffering. The numbers on the page, profits, losses, assets, started to take on a human weight. This transformation of understanding from abstract finance to concrete sin marked the beginning of her descent into a truth from which she would never be able to return. The world outside the study continued its placid, elegant rhythm. Carriages rolled down the cobblestone streets, garden parties filled the afternoons with polite conversation, and the bells of St. Michael's Church tolled the hours. Amelia was expected to rejoin this world, to emerge from her mourning and take her place in the seasonal rituals of Charleston's elite. But the more she learned from the papers in her father's desk, the more alien that world became to her. Her diary reveals a woman increasingly at odds with her own existence, a silent observer questioning the very reality her peers accepted as natural and ordained by God. The first crack in Amelia's carefully constructed reality appeared not with a sudden shock, but with the quiet turning of a page. Deep within a cabinet, filed under the unassuming label of domestic valuations, she found a collection of documents that differed from the others. These were not property deeds or stock certificates. They were life insurance policies underwritten by a firm in London. Such policies were common for protecting valuable assets like cargo ships or warehouses. But as she examined the details, a cold, sickening realization began to dawn on her. The assets being insured were not inanimate objects. They were the enslaved men, women, and children of her own household. Her diary entry for that day is short and stark, the handwriting showing signs of a tremor. She wrote, "To profit from their labor was a crime I understood, but to profit from their death, this is a wickedness for which there is no name." The practice, though not unheard of, was considered deeply cynical even by the standards of the time. It represented the ultimate commodification of a human being, reducing a life to a financial calculation where a death could be more profitable than continued service. For Amelia, this discovery was a profound moral violation, a transgression that pushed her family's sins beyond the realm of commerce and into something far darker. Among the list of names, each followed by an age, a physical description, and a monetary value, one entry stood out. It was for a young man named Isaac, aged 20, with a valuation that was nearly double that of any other individual on the estate. Beside his name were the annotations: mulatto, literate, and serving in the main house. The detail of his literacy was particularly striking. In a state where teaching an enslaved person to read and write was a criminal act, Isaac's education made him both an immense asset and a potential threat. The high insurance value placed upon him was a cold acknowledgement of this fact. He was too valuable to lose, whether to illness, accident, or escape. This document was the first tangible piece of evidence that forced Amelia to confront the human reality of the names in her father's ledgers. Isaac was not just a line item in a portfolio. He was a person living under her own roof, a man whose potential death had already been assigned a price. The discovery compelled her to act, to bridge the gap between the abstract record and the living individual. For the first time, she summoned one of the enslaved people of her house, not to issue a command, but to ask a question. She sent word for Isaac to be brought to her father's study, the very room where she had just uncovered the chilling calculus of his existence. The meeting is described in her diary with a sense of profound unease. She had expected the quiet deference that characterized interactions between master and slave. Instead, she found herself in the presence of a man whose intelligence and self-possession immediately unsettled her. She wrote, "He speaks like a free man. He looks me in the eyes as if to judge me, and what wounds me most is that he may be right." Isaac, it turned out, knew more about the Hollingsworth empire than she did. During her father's long illness, it was he who had secretly managed the household accounts, corresponded with business partners, and ensured the continued operation of the estate. He answered her questions about the insurance policies with a calm, almost detached precision, explaining them as just another tool of her father's trade. There was no emotion in his voice, no hint of the horror she felt, only a deep, weary understanding of the system that owned him. This composure was, for Amelia, more damning than any outburst of anger could have been. It revealed a man who had been forced to become an expert in the mechanics of his own dehumanization. He was not just a victim of the system, he was a reluctant and brilliant functionary within it. The initial meeting, intended to last only a few minutes, stretched for hours. Amelia's questions shifted from the insurance policies to the broader workings of the estate, and Isaac answered each one with an unnerving command of the facts. He laid bare the intricate web of debt, credit and trade that sustained her family, revealing a level of business acumen that would have been celebrated in any white man. In him, she saw a reflection of her father's own shrewdness, but it was an intelligence that had been captured, controlled, and forced into the service of its own oppression. This encounter marked a fundamental turning point in Amelia's journey. The clear, rigid line between master and slave, between the one who commands and the one who obeys, had been blurred. She had sought information about a financial asset and had instead been confronted with an intellectual equal. The diary entries that follow this meeting are filled with a new kind of turmoil. She was no longer just grappling with her father's sins. She was now grappling with the undeniable humanity and intellect of a man her world had defined as property. Her perception of her own home began to change. The familiar spaces of the mansion now seemed charged with a new, unspoken tension. She started to see the silent, efficient movements of the household staff, not as a sign of a well-run estate, but as a carefully orchestrated performance of submission. She began to wonder what other secrets, what other intelligences lay hidden behind the impassive faces of the people who served her. The house, once a symbol of security and power, was slowly becoming a place of profound and unsettling mystery. The formal meetings in the study soon gave way to something far more dangerous. Driven by a need to understand the full scope of the world she had inherited, Amelia began to seek out Isaac under the cover of darkness. Her diary documents these clandestine conversations, which took place in the servants' quarters, a collection of small brick buildings behind the main house. For a white woman of her station to enter this space, especially at night and alone, was a transgression of the deepest social taboos. It was an act that, if discovered, would have brought immediate ruin upon her name. These nocturnal visits became her true education. Away from the oppressive formality of the mansion, in the dimly lit space of Isaac's small room, the dynamic between them continued to shift. He was no longer just an informant explaining financial ledgers. He became a teacher, a guide into the hidden moral landscape of Charleston. He spoke of the world beyond the narrow confines of the aristocracy, a world of resistance, philosophy, and a theology of liberation that was taking root in secret praise houses and black churches throughout the South. Isaac, she learned, was part of a network. He showed her letters smuggled into the city by sympathetic sailors and merchants from abolitionists in Philadelphia and Boston. These were not the crude caricatures of northern agitators described in Charleston newspapers. They were eloquent, impassioned arguments against the institution of slavery, grounded in scripture and the principles of natural law. He read them to her aloud, his voice steady and clear, and with each word, the moral foundations of her world crumbled a little further. She was hearing, for the first time, a coherent and powerful articulation of the very doubts that had begun to haunt her own conscience. The diary entries from this period, the winter of 1844, are filled with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She wrote, "Each day he peels back another layer of the world I inhabit. I now see that 27 East Battery is not a home, but a tomb built upon the bones of others." Her complicity in the system became an unbearable weight. She was not just the beneficiary of her father's crimes. As the current owner of the estate, she was their active perpetrator. The food she ate, the clothes she wore, the very air she breathed seemed to be sustained by a foundation of profound and unforgivable sin. Isaac did not just show her the words of others, he shared his own. He had kept a hidden journal, a collection of his thoughts on freedom, faith, and the nature of justice. In its pages, Amelia discovered a mind of extraordinary depth and sophistication. He wrote about the hypocrisy of a nation founded on liberty that practiced tyranny, and he wrestled with the theological question of how a just God could permit such suffering. His writings were not merely a plea for freedom, but a philosophical indictment of the entire social and religious order of the South. These conversations and readings became a ritual, a secret liturgy of truth-telling in the heart of a city built on lies. Amelia's role shifted from that of a curious mistress to that of a devoted student, and then to something deeper. A profound intellectual and spiritual intimacy grew between them, a connection that defied every category her world provided. It was not a relationship that could be named or understood by the society that surrounded them. It was a shared recognition of a truth so powerful and dangerous that it could only be spoken in whispers in the dead of night. This accumulation of knowledge led to a growing sense of urgency. It was no longer enough for Amelia to understand the nature of her family's guilt. She felt compelled to act, to begin the process of dismantling the engine of oppression she now controlled. But the system was designed to be unbreakable. The laws of South Carolina made it nearly impossible for an owner to free an enslaved person. Manumission, the legal act of granting freedom, was severely restricted and required posting an enormous bond and ensuring the freed individual immediately left the state. Any attempt to do so would draw immediate and hostile scrutiny. Faced with these legal barriers, Amelia and Isaac began to devise a different kind of plan, one that did not seek to work within the law, but to subvert it from the inside. The evidence of this shift appears in her diary as a change in tone, from passive horror to active conspiracy. The entries become more cryptic, filled with coded references to financial transactions and the movement of assets. She was no longer just a chronicler of her own awakening. She was now documenting the first steps of a deliberate and dangerous rebellion. The risk they were taking was immense. For Isaac, discovery would mean certain death, likely by the most brutal means imaginable, as an example to others. For Amelia, it would mean social annihilation, institutionalization for insanity, and the seizure of her estate by her concerned relatives. They were two people from opposite ends of the power spectrum, bound together by a shared secret and a common purpose. Their alliance, forged in the shadows of the Hollingsworth mansion, was an impossible and audacious act of defiance against the world that had tried to define them. As the winter of 1844 deepened, the scattered pieces of evidence in Amelia's mind began to coalesce into a single, devastating hypothesis. It was a realization that went far beyond the guilt of her own family, extending to the very heart of Charleston's identity. Sifting through decades of her father's records, with Isaac's guidance to decipher the coded language of the trade, she began to see a pattern. The wealth of the city's great families, their own, the Pinckneys, the Middletons, the Rutledges, was not just sustained by slavery, it was morally and financially indistinguishable from it. There was no clean money, no corner of their society untouched by the stain. This understanding is articulated in a frantic, ink-blotched entry in her diary, a passage that reads less like a reflection and more like a verdict. She wrote, "There can be no cleansing of this name. It cannot be redeemed. It can only be dissolved. The fortune must revert to its source. It is the only penance possible." This was her hypothesis, that the only moral act available to her was not reform, not charity, not even abolition in the abstract, but a complete and total dissolution of her own legacy. She had to unmake the world that had made her, starting with the Hollingsworth name itself. This decision marked a radical shift in her thinking. She was no longer seeking a way to live ethically within a corrupt system. She had concluded that the system itself was the sin, and that her participation in it, no matter how benevolent, was a continuation of the crime. Her inheritance was not a fortune to be managed, but a poison that had to be neutralized. The only way to do so, she believed, was to redirect its power back to the people from whom it had been stolen. This was not a plan for escape, as in so many other stories of resistance. It was a plan for a form of historical and economic justice so profound that no one in her world could have conceived of it. The first concrete action stemming from this hypothesis is documented in the city's public records. Beginning in the spring of 1844, Amelia Hollingsworth began a systematic and quiet liquidation of her assets. Vast tracts of cotton land in the upstate were sold, shares in shipping companies were divested, and accounts in London banks were closed. To the outside world, these moves were puzzling, seen as the erratic decisions of a young, inexperienced woman overwhelmed by her father's complex affairs. Her male relatives offered their assistance in managing the estate, offers that she politely but firmly refused. They could not have known that she was not mismanaging the family fortune. She was deliberately dismantling it. The proceeds from these sales were not reinvested or spent on luxuries. Instead, they were used for a purpose that had to be conducted with the utmost secrecy. Working through intermediaries, often free black artisans and merchants with connections in the North, she began to purchase manumission papers for the people enslaved under her own name. It was a slow, expensive, and perilous process. Each act of liberation was a delicate negotiation, a legal fiction that had to be carefully constructed to avoid the suspicion of the authorities. She was, in effect, using the wealth generated by slavery to buy freedom from the very system that wealth upheld. Her diary entries from this period are filled with the logistical details of this operation. She writes of late-night meetings with lawyers of questionable repute, of transferring large sums of cash, and of arranging for safe passage north for those she managed to free. It was a dangerous game of conspiracy, a private war against the institution that surrounded her. She was acutely aware of the irony of her actions, as she noted in one entry, "I am using the devil's own currency to purchase souls back from his grasp. I do not know if such a transaction can ever be considered clean." This process of liberation was not just a financial and legal strategy. It was a deeply personal and emotionally taxing endeavor. With each family she managed to send north, she felt a small measure of relief, but it was always overshadowed by the immense scale of the injustice that remained. She could not free everyone. She could not undo the generations of suffering that had built her house. Her actions, radical as they were, felt to her like a single drop of water on a raging fire. This sense of inadequacy, of the impossibility of true atonement, began to take a heavy toll on her spirit. The hypothesis that had once seemed so clear, that the fortune must be returned to its source, was proving to be far more complicated in practice. The source was not a single entity, but a multitude of individuals, families and generations, scattered and broken by the machine of slavery. Her plan for a grand, symbolic act of justice was colliding with the messy, painful reality of individual lives. She was freeing people, but she could not erase their trauma, restore their stolen past, or guarantee their future safety. This tension between her absolute moral vision and the practical limitations of her power is a recurring theme in the final year of her diary. She becomes increasingly obsessed with the idea of a single, definitive act that could somehow encapsulate her entire project of atonement. She believed that dissolving her assets piece by piece was not enough. She needed a final gesture, a legal and symbolic act so powerful and unambiguous that it would resonate beyond her own lifetime, serving as a permanent judgment on the Hollingsworth name and the world it represented. This search for a final, perfect act of rebellion would ultimately lead her to the decision that would seal her own fate. By the end of 1844, Amelia's quiet war against her own legacy could no longer be contained within the walls of her mansion. The systematic sale of Hollingsworth properties and the unusual financial activities associated with her name began to attract notice, and the whispers that had been confined to drawing rooms started to grow into a chorus of public concern and condemnation. The social fabric of Charleston, woven with threads of gossip, suspicion, and rigid expectation, began to tear around her. She was no longer seen as merely eccentric. She was becoming a threat to the established order. The first public salvo against her was fired from the most powerful institution in the city, the church. The Reverend of St. Michael's Parish, a man whose sermons typically celebrated the divinely ordained harmony of Charleston society, delivered a thinly veiled attack on one of his most prominent parishioners. In a sermon preserved in the church's archives, he spoke of an inheritance of duty and decried those who, in their pride or folly, would seek to undo the work of their forefathers. He concluded with a warning against the heiress who has turned her back on her duties to God and her race, a phrase that left no one in the congregation mistaken about his target. This public denunciation was a turning point. It transformed private rumors into a matter of public morality, effectively sanctioning Amelia's ostracism. Her invitations to social events ceased. Old family friends would cross the street to avoid greeting her. The few who dared to speak to her did so with a mixture of pity and condescension, urging her to accept the guidance of her male relatives before she brought complete ruin upon her family's name. Her isolation, once a product of her own internal struggle, was now being violently imposed upon her from the outside. She had become a pariah in her own city. The suspicion was not limited to the upper echelons of society. A letter, discovered decades later in a collection of municipal papers, reveals the anxieties of her immediate neighbors. The letter, dated January 1845 and written by the owner of the adjacent property on East Battery, complains to the City Watch about strange noises coming from the Hollingsworth estate. The neighbor describes hearing rhythmic chanting and voices from beneath the mansion late at night, sounds he attributed to illicit religious gatherings or some other form of forbidden activity. These were likely the sounds of the secret meetings and praise sessions Amelia was now attending with the few remaining enslaved people in her household. Amelia's diary records this period of social fracture with a sense of grim inevitability. She wrote, "They look at me in the street as if I am a ghost. Perhaps I am. The woman I was is dead, and the one who remains has no place in this world." She describes the cold, averted gazes, the sudden silences that would fall over a room when she entered. She felt herself becoming invisible, an unperson whose existence was an embarrassment to the collective conscience of her class. This experience of being erased by her own community seemed to only strengthen her resolve. If they were determined to cast her out, she would give them a reason they would never forget. The pressure was not only social, but also legal and financial. Her cousins, citing her erratic behavior and the rapid depletion of the family estate, began to make inquiries about having her declared mentally incompetent. Such a move would allow them to assume control of her assets, preserving what was left of the Hollingsworth fortune and, not incidentally, securing their own inheritances. Amelia was in a race against time, needing to complete her final act of atonement before the legal mechanisms of her own class could be used to stop her. The house at 27 East Battery became a fortress, a sanctuary of rebellion in a hostile city. She dismissed most of the household staff, keeping only a few individuals in whom she had absolute trust. The grand rooms, once filled with the sounds of social gatherings, fell silent. The gardens grew wild. The mansion, once a symbol of Hollingsworth power, was now a visible testament to the family's strange and rapid decline. It stood on the Charleston waterfront like a haunted house, its shuttered windows like closed eyes, guarding the secrets that were unfolding within. This public isolation had a profound psychological impact on Amelia. Her diary entries become more introspective, more concerned with spiritual matters than with the logistical details of her plans. She writes of long nights spent in prayer and conversation with Isaac, discussing the nature of sacrifice, redemption, and what it meant to have a soul. She was stripping away the external markers of her identity, her social standing, her wealth, her family name, in a search for a more essential, authentic self. This process was both a liberation and a form of self-destruction. The social fracture was complete. Amelia Hollingsworth had effectively seceded from her own world. She had betrayed the unspoken covenant of her class to protect the family name and the system that gave it power at all costs. In choosing to align herself with the enslaved, she had crossed a line from which there was no return. The stage was now set for the final tragic act of her rebellion, a confrontation that would not play out in the drawing rooms of Charleston, but in the silent chambers of her own home and the cold, unforgiving language of the law. In the early spring of 1845, as the city of Charleston was coming alive with the scent of jasmine and the promise of a new social season, Amelia was confronted with a final, irrefutable piece of evidence that would shatter what little remained of her composure. The discovery came not from a new document she unearthed, but from a deeper examination of a set of ledgers she had previously overlooked. Isaac, whose memory of the family's business was encyclopedic, guided her to a volume detailing transactions that were considered too distasteful to be included in the main financial records. This was the ledger of the family's domestic slave trade. Within its pages, Amelia found a systematic accounting of the sale of human beings, not to distant plantations, but within the city of Charleston itself. These were not anonymous figures. They were the children, spouses, and parents of the people who had served her family for generations. The ledger detailed the cold, brutal economics of separating families, a practice her father had always publicly condemned as the mark of a cruel and unsophisticated master. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The document was a testament to a secret internal trade in human sorrow conducted to balance the books and maximize profit. The most devastating entry was a single-line item from over a decade earlier. It recorded the sale of a 10-year-old girl named Sarah, sold to a trader bound for the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, a place from which few ever returned. Beside the entry was a note indicating the girl's parentage. She was Isaac's younger sister. This discovery transformed the historical crime into a present and personal wound. The grief that Isaac had carried in silence for years was now laid bare before her, a stark and undeniable indictment of the family she represented. Amelia's diary entry for that night contains only 7 words, a sentence that speaks to a complete and total emotional collapse. She wrote, "His grief has become my own." In that moment of shared sorrow, the last vestiges of the distance between them, the roles of mistress and slave, of benefactor and recipient, dissolved completely. His loss was now her responsibility, the culmination of all the abstract sins she had uncovered. The weight of this final revelation proved to be too much for her to bear. The documented impact of this discovery is found in the city's medical records. A physician, Dr. Thomas May, was called to the Hollingsworth mansion in March of 1845. His notes, preserved in his private papers, describe his patient, Amelia Hollingsworth, as suffering from a severe nervous collapse. He found her confined to her bedroom, refusing to speak, consumed by what he diagnosed as an acute attack of melancholy. He prescribed rest, laudanum, and the immediate intervention of her family to manage her affairs. He noted with concern that she seemed to be under the sole care of one of her servants, a detail he found highly irregular. This medical diagnosis became the final piece of ammunition her relatives needed. Her collapse was seen as proof of her mental instability, a tragic but convenient justification for seizing control of her estate. They began formal legal proceedings to have her declared incompetent, a process that would strip her of all legal and financial autonomy. Amelia was now a prisoner in her own home, her rebellion seemingly at an end, her final grand act of atonement now apparently impossible. But her silence was not one of defeat. It was a period of profound internal reckoning. Confined to her room, she was cut off from the world, but this isolation allowed for a final terrible clarity. The path forward was no longer a matter of strategy or logistics, it was a matter of spiritual necessity. The plan she had been formulating with Isaac now had to be executed with the utmost urgency before the world outside her door could intervene and silence her for good. The irrefutable evidence of her family's cruelty did not break her spirit. It forged it into a final, unshakable resolve. Her grief was not a passive state of suffering, it was a catalyst, a fire that consumed all her remaining doubts and fears. She had seen the absolute worst of what her name represented, and she was now prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice to ensure that it would never cause such pain again. Her apparent collapse was, in fact, the quiet gathering of strength before the final, decisive act. The historical record from this point forward becomes a tense and suspenseful countdown. On one side were her relatives and the legal system of Charleston, moving with deliberate speed to wrest control from her. On the other was a woman, officially declared mentally unsound, working in secret with her enslaved confidant to execute a final revolutionary act. The mansion at 27 East Battery had become the stage for a silent, desperate battle over the future of the Hollingsworth legacy. The authority that was meant to protect the established order of Charleston began to collapse around Amelia, not through direct confrontation, but through her radical and silent refusal to recognize its legitimacy. The first institution to fail was that of her own family. Her relatives, who saw themselves as the rightful guardians of the Hollingsworth name, were rendered powerless by her simple refusal to communicate. A letter from her eldest cousin, preserved in his family's papers, reveals their frustration. He pleads with her to allow them entry to the house, to accept their help, and to return to the path of reason. The letter was returned to him, its seal unbroken. They were locked out, their authority extending only to the mansion's front gate. The next authority to be circumvented was the legal system. Even as her cousins were preparing their case to have her declared incompetent, Amelia was taking steps to ensure her will, the one she had been planning with Isaac, would be her final, unassailable word. The execution of this plan required finding someone within the system who could be persuaded to defy its conventions. This person was a junior court clerk named Samuel Gray, a man so insignificant that he has left almost no other trace in the historical record. The filing of Amelia's new will is documented by a single, unusual notation in the registrar's log at the Charleston courthouse. The entry, dated in the first week of April 1845, records the submission of a last will and testament for Amelia Hollingsworth. The clerk on duty noted that the filing was conducted after official hours, that the document was brought in by Samuel Gray, and that it was sealed immediately upon receipt, with instructions that it was not to be opened until after the testator's death. This after-hours secret filing was a clear breach of protocol, a small act of administrative rebellion that would have enormous consequences. The fate of Samuel Gray is a chilling testament to the danger of defying the powerful. Within a month of this clandestine act, his name disappears from all Charleston records. He was no longer employed at the courthouse. He was not listed in the city directory. His church had no record of his departure or death. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. The quiet efficiency of his erasure suggests that his role in Amelia's plan may have been discovered, and that he paid a high price for his brief alliance with the defiant heiress. His disappearance stands as a dark footnote to the story, a reminder of the mortal peril faced by anyone who dared to challenge the city's ruling class. The medical authority that had declared Amelia incompetent was also rendered irrelevant. Dr. May's diagnosis was intended to be the first step in stripping her of her agency, but she refused to be a passive patient. She dismissed the doctor, barred him from her home, and rejected his prescribed treatments. Her supposed madness became her shield, a cloak of invisibility that allowed her to make her final preparations without interference. Her family and the authorities saw her as a broken woman, lost to reason, while in reality she was operating with a singular, focused purpose that they were incapable of comprehending. This collapse of external authority, familial, legal, and medical, left Amelia in a state of perilous autonomy. She was completely isolated, but she was also, for the first time, completely free to act according to her own conscience. The world had cast her out, and in doing so, had unwittingly given her the freedom to execute her final, radical plan. She was no longer bound by the expectations of her class or the laws of her state. She was now accountable only to her own moral vision and to the man who had helped her shape it. The Hollingsworth mansion, during these final weeks, became a sovereign territory, a small independent state of two, governed by its own laws of justice and atonement. The authority of Charleston, with its sheriffs, its judges, and its patriarchs, could not penetrate its walls. The carefully constructed social order, which relied on the voluntary participation of its members, had failed to contain Amelia's rebellion. She had simply refused to play the game, and in doing so had revealed the fragility of the power that held her world together. This period of quiet, intense preparation is largely undocumented, existing only in the space between the last coherent entry in her diary and the final, violent conclusion of her story. We can only imagine the conversations that took place, the final instructions given, the shared understanding of the immense risk they were about to take. The collapse of the world's authority had created a vacuum, and into that vacuum, Amelia and Isaac were about to unleash an act that would leave a permanent scar on the history of Charleston. The final element of authority to be defied was the most fundamental of all, the law of property. The entire legal and social structure of the South was built upon the principle that a human being could be an object, a piece of property to be bought, sold, and inherited. Amelia's will was designed to be a direct and catastrophic attack on this principle. She was about to use the law of property to annihilate itself, a legal paradox that was as brilliant as it was dangerous. The authorities could not stop her because they could not even conceive of what she was about to do. For over 50 years, the official story of Amelia Hollingsworth's death remained undisturbed, a settled matter of tragic suicide. The narrative was simple and convenient. A troubled, eccentric heiress, overwhelmed by her inheritance and suffering from female hysteria, had taken her own life in a moment of despair. The fire was seen as a final, dramatic manifestation of her madness. This version of events was neat, it was tidy, and most importantly, it allowed Charleston society to forget the uncomfortable questions that her life and death had raised. The truth, however, lay dormant, buried in a dusty, forgotten corner of the city archives. The hidden source that would ultimately challenge this official narrative was not discovered by a historian or a journalist, but was compiled by a diligent municipal clerk in 1899. The document was an internal report on unsolved fires in Charleston's history, a dry, bureaucratic review of cold cases. Tucked away in a section on the Hollingsworth blaze was a series of interviews the clerk had conducted with retired firemen and city watchmen, men who had been present at the scene on that fateful night in April 1845. Their recollections, recorded more than half a century after the event, painted a picture that was far more sinister than the official record suggested. One testimony from a retired fire marshal was particularly damning. He claimed that what he and his men had seen in the mansion's cellar had been deliberately omitted from their official report, under pressure from Amelia's influential relatives and the city's leading officials. He described a scene that had nothing to do with a fire that had started in the upper floors. On a heavy oak beam in the center of the cellar ceiling, he had found deep, abrasive rope burns, as if a heavy weight had been suspended from it. Directly below this beam, on the cold stone floor, was a large, dark stain that his men had believed to be blood. This testimony fundamentally altered the entire understanding of Amelia's death. The evidence it described was not consistent with suicide by smoke inhalation. It was consistent with a hanging. The location of this evidence in the cellar, far from where her body was found, suggested a violent, clandestine act, a scene that had been deliberately staged and then concealed. The fire, in this new interpretation, was not the instrument of her suicide, but a tool used to destroy the evidence of her murder. The 1899 report did not draw any final conclusions. The clerk who compiled it presented the testimony without comment, letting the chilling implications speak for themselves. The document was never made public. It was an internal municipal review, and once completed, it was filed away and forgotten, another layer of silence settling over the dark history of the Hollingsworth case. Its rediscovery by researchers in the 1950s, following the unsealing of Amelia's will, was like finding a key that unlocked a hidden, far more horrific chamber in the story. This hidden source revealed the probable motive for her murder. Her relatives, having learned of the radical new will she had secretly filed, would have been faced with a catastrophic loss of fortune and an unbearable public shame. The will would not only disinherit them, but it would also serve as a public declaration of the family's profound moral guilt. In the brutal logic of their world, murdering Amelia and destroying the evidence would have been seen as a necessary, if tragic, act to protect the family's honor and financial future. They would have believed they were not committing a crime, but performing a painful duty. The discovery of this report casts the events of her final days in a new, terrifying light. Her isolation, her nervous collapse, her refusal to see her family, these may not have been just symptoms of her psychological distress, but calculated moves in a deadly chess game. She may have known that her life was in danger, that her relatives would stop at nothing to prevent her plan from coming to fruition. Her final act was not just about securing her legacy, it was about outmaneuvering her own murderers. The report also deepens the mystery of Isaac's disappearance. If Amelia was murdered, then he was not just a fleeing heir, he was the sole witness to a capital crime. His escape from Charleston was not just a journey toward freedom and a new life, but a desperate flight from the powerful men who had just killed his benefactor and would surely have sought to silence him next. He carried with him not only the promise of a vast fortune, but the dangerous secret of how that fortune had come into his possession. This hidden source, a forgotten bureaucratic report, thus becomes the most explosive document in the entire case. It reframes the story from a tragedy of a troubled woman to a dark conspiracy of murder and concealment orchestrated by the highest levels of Charleston society. It suggests that the city's elite were willing to commit the ultimate crime to protect the system that guaranteed their power. Amelia's rebellion was so profound that it could only be answered with absolute, final violence. In the final coherent entry of her diary, written just days after her physician had declared her mentally unsound, Amelia Hollingsworth laid out the justification for her last, decisive action. The entry is not the rambling of a disturbed mind. It is a document of chilling lucidity, a final testament written by a woman who knew she was likely about to die. She had been pushed to the edge, not by madness, but by a moral clarity so intense that it had become unbearable. Her decision to draft the will was, in her own words, the only sane act left to her in a world that had lost its mind. She began the entry by confronting the diagnosis that had been placed upon her. She wrote, "They believe I have lost my mind, but for the first time I see the world as it is." This single sentence is a powerful refutation of her accusers. She reclaims her sanity by defining it not as conformity to social norms, but as the courage to see and name the truth, no matter how horrifying. Her nervous collapse was not a descent into madness, but an agonizing passage through a curtain of lies to a place of stark, unshielded reality. Her justification for the will was articulated not as an act of charity, but as an act of execution. "I will not be the caretaker of this legacy," she wrote. "I will be its executioner." She had come to see the Hollingsworth name and fortune as a living entity, a malevolent force that had consumed generations of lives. Her duty, as the last of her line, was not to preserve it, but to destroy it. The will was to be the legal instrument of this execution, a carefully crafted weapon designed to turn the system's own logic against itself. The document she describes is a masterpiece of legal and moral subversion. She explains her reasoning with cold precision. "The law created this sin, and so the law shall be its undoing." She understood that the institution of slavery was, at its core, a legal fiction, a set of property laws that had been elevated to the status of natural order. By using the laws of inheritance, the sacred process by which property and power were transferred, to name an enslaved man as her heir, She was creating a legal paradox that the system could not resolve without exposing its own inherent contradictions. The source also reveals the depth of her trust in Isaac. She does not describe herself as his savior, but as his partner in a conspiracy. She wrote, "I have instructed Isaac on what he must do. May God grant him the strength to survive my final gift to him." She understood that her act of liberation was also a terrible burden. She was not just giving him a fortune, she was giving him a dangerous and complicated future. He would be a man of immense wealth, but he would also be a fugitive, a target, a living symbol of a revolution that his world would do anything to crush. This final entry justifies her action as a form of spiritual imperative. She was not motivated by politics or social reform in the abstract. Her decision was deeply personal, rooted in her own need for atonement and her profound connection to Isaac. The will was her confession, her act of penance, and her only hope for a form of salvation that had nothing to do with the church that had condemned her. It was a private covenant with her own conscience, made public through the cold, impersonal language of the law. The suspense in this final entry comes from its calm, deliberate tone. She is a woman preparing for her own death, but there is no fear or self-pity in her words. There is only a sense of profound and solemn purpose. She is meticulously planning the demolition of her own world, and she describes the steps with the detachment of an architect reviewing a set of blueprints. This cold resolve is more terrifying than any emotional outburst. It is the calm at the center of a storm that is about to break over Charleston. The justification is also a direct challenge to the future, to the people who she knew would one day read her words. She was not just explaining her actions to herself, she was leaving a record for posterity, ensuring that the true motive for her rebellion would not be lost to history. She was arming the future with the truth, trusting that one day a world would exist that was capable of understanding what she had done and why. The diary, in this sense, was as important as the will itself. One was the act, the other was its soul. In these final sentences, Amelia Hollingsworth ceased to be a victim of her circumstances. She became a conscious and deliberate agent of history, a woman who chose to sacrifice her life, her fortune, and her name not for personal gain, but for an idea of justice that was far ahead of her time. Her decision, as justified in her own hand, was a radical act of hope in a world defined by despair, a final, defiant belief in the possibility of redemption, no matter how high the cost. The climax of the Hollingsworth case unfolds not in a single dramatic event, but through the cold, conflicting language of two official documents, written half a century apart. The first is the Charleston Coroner's Report, dated April 29, 1845. This document represents the official, sanctioned truth. It describes, in detached and clinical terms, the discovery of Amelia Hollingsworth's remains in the master bedroom of her burned-out mansion. The cause of death is listed simply as suicide by smoke inhalation. The report notes the disordered state of the room, the lingering smell of soot and ash, and concludes that the fire was likely set by the deceased in a final, desperate act. This official interpretation served the needs of Charleston society perfectly. It closed the book on a difficult and embarrassing chapter in the city's history. Amelia was posthumously diagnosed and dismissed, her rebellion recast as the tragic but predictable outcome of female instability. Her name could now be quietly removed from the social registers, her story reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. The system had successfully absorbed and neutralized her defiance, transforming her into a victim of her own fragile mind rather than a martyr to a radical cause. But a second, final primary source offers a profoundly different and far more disturbing interpretation. This is the 1899 Municipal Report on Unsolved Fires, the hidden source that lay buried for decades. Its account of the scene directly contradicts the coroner's findings. It presents the testimony about the rope burns in the cellar, the bloodstain on the floor, and the suspicion among the firemen that they were witnessing the aftermath not of a suicide, but of a murder. This report posits that Amelia was killed by her own relatives, who then set the fire to conceal their crime and prevent the execution of her revolutionary will. The most poignant and powerful piece of evidence from the scene, however, is a small detail mentioned in both reports, but interpreted in vastly different ways. On the bedside table, next to where Amelia's body was found, lay an open Bible. The coroner's report notes its presence as a final, ironic detail, perhaps a last-minute plea for a salvation she had ultimately rejected. But the fire marshal's inventory list, attached to the 1899 report, specifies the exact passage to which the Bible was turned. It was the Book of Ruth, chapter 1, verse 16, where Ruth, a foreigner, pledges her undying loyalty to her mother-in-law Naomi, saying, "For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." In the context of Amelia's story, this passage is transformed from a simple statement of familial loyalty into a radical declaration of spiritual and racial solidarity. In her final moments, whether by her own hand or that of her murderers, this was the verse she chose to leave behind. It was her final message, a testament to her decision to abandon her own people, the white aristocracy of Charleston, and cast her lot with Isaac, a representative of the enslaved people her family had oppressed. Her choice of scripture was a final, defiant act of self-redefinition. This passage also carries a deeper, more intimate meaning. The story of Ruth and Naomi is one of the Bible's most powerful accounts of a bond between two women who choose to create a family outside the conventional lines of blood and marriage. By leaving this passage open, Amelia may have been sanctifying her relationship with Isaac, framing it not as a forbidden or sinful connection, but as a sacred covenant, a chosen kinship that was more powerful and legitimate in the eyes of her God than the blood ties she had been born into. The question of Isaac's whereabouts on the night of the fire remains the story's most haunting mystery. The official narrative assumes he perished in the blaze, another anonymous victim of the tragedy. But the 1899 report suggests a different scenario, that he escaped, just as he and Amelia had planned, carrying with him the knowledge of her murder and the legal claim to her fortune. His absence from the scene is not proof of his death, but evidence of his survival, the first successful step in fulfilling the dangerous mission she had entrusted to him. The interpretation of these final sources depends entirely on which narrative one chooses to believe. Was Amelia a mad woman who took her own life, or was she a clear-eyed revolutionary who was murdered for her convictions? Was the Bible a sign of her despair or a symbol of her ultimate triumph? The ambiguity is perhaps the point. Her death, like her life, resists easy categorization. It exists in the space between history and legend, between the documented fact and the whispered truth. The final image from the scene, the heiress's body lying in a ruined room beside a sacred text open to a passage of radical devotion, is a tableau of profound moral and spiritual significance. It is the culmination of her journey, a silent, powerful statement of her final allegiance. The fire consumed her body, but it could not destroy the meaning of her sacrifice. That meaning was left behind, written in the pages of her diary, encoded in the language of her will, and immortalized in her choice of a final verse. The two competing interpretations of her death, suicide or murder, represent the two worlds that fought for her soul. One is the world of her family and her class, which sought to dismiss her as insane. The other is the world she chose, a world of justice and solidarity, which saw her as a martyr. The historical record contains evidence for both, leaving us to weigh the documents, to sift through the lies, and to decide for ourselves which version of the story holds the greater truth. The immediate consequence of the fire at 27 East Battery was the successful suppression of Amelia Hollingsworth's story. In the aftermath, her relatives, the very people who may have orchestrated her death, positioned themselves as the grieving guardians of a disgraced family name. They sold the ruined mansion, settled what remained of the estate's debts, and quietly absorbed the diminished assets. Publicly, they maintained the narrative of a tragic suicide, a fiction that allowed them to preserve their social standing and bury the dangerous truth of Amelia's will. For decades, it seemed as if their conspiracy of silence had succeeded completely. The true consequences of Amelia's final act, however, were unfolding in secret, far to the north. The unsealing of her will in 1951 provided the first documented proof of this. The legal proceedings that followed were a quiet affair, conducted without public fanfare, but their conclusion was revolutionary. The courts, presented with a legally sound, if morally unprecedented document, had no choice but to uphold it. The will was declared valid. The entire remaining Hollingsworth estate was legally transferred to its sole-named heir, Isaac, formerly the property of the Hollingsworth family. The historical record then picks up his trail, faintly at first, in the archives of Philadelphia. Property records from Charleston show that the mansion at 27 East Battery, now legally his, was sold via a proxy agent in 1846. The substantial funds from this sale were then wired to a bank in Philadelphia. The 1850 United States Census for that city contains an entry that is almost certainly him, a merchant named Isaac Hollingsworth, his race marked as mulatto, living in a prosperous neighborhood. The entry includes a chillingly appropriate notation in the column for place of birth, of unknown origin. He had successfully erased his past, just as Amelia had erased her own. Isaac Hollingsworth appears in Philadelphia city directories for the next decade as a man of considerable wealth and influence, a financier with connections to abolitionist causes and a reputation for a European education and a reserved, almost melancholy demeanor. He never married and had no children. He was a man who had been given everything: fortune, freedom, a new identity, but at the cost of everything he had ever known. He vanishes from all records after 1860, on the eve of the Civil War. Whether he moved abroad, changed his name again, or simply died remains unknown. He disappeared into the great anonymous currents of history, his mission fulfilled. The legacy of Amelia Hollingsworth, meanwhile, underwent a slow and remarkable resurrection. The discovery of her diary and the subsequent academic interest in her case transformed her from a forgotten eccentric into a figure of profound historical significance. She is now seen as a rare, documented example of a white Southern woman who underwent a complete moral and political awakening and who used her own privilege as a weapon against the system that had granted it. Her story challenges comfortable narratives about the antebellum South, revealing the potential for radical conscience to exist in the most unlikely of places. The most tangible piece of her legacy was not discovered until 1960. During a major restoration of the mansion at 27 East Battery, workers were stripping away layers of old plaster from a wall in the main parlor. Beneath a section that had been sealed off since the mid-19th century, they found something extraordinary. A mural painted directly onto the original plaster. It depicted two figures, a white woman with striking auburn hair and a black man. They were standing side by side, holding hands, and on their fingers were simple matching gold wedding rings. In the bottom corner of the painting were the initials AH and the year 1845. This hidden portrait was the final, stunning confirmation of the true nature of the bond between Amelia and Isaac. It was not just a relationship of teacher and student or of conspirators in a cause. It was a marriage, a sacred union that they had solemnized in secret, an act of ultimate defiance against the laws of God and man as their world understood them. The portrait was their wedding certificate, their declaration of a love that was so forbidden it had to be hidden beneath a layer of stone. It remains the most powerful and intimate artifact of their story. Today, the Hollingsworth name has been effectively erased from the official tours and guidebooks of Charleston. The city, which trades on its carefully curated history, has no place for a story that so profoundly indicts its founding families. The house at 27 East Battery is a private residence, its history a secret known only to a few. There is no plaque, no monument, no public acknowledgement of the extraordinary events that took place within its walls. The silence that her relatives imposed by force is now maintained by a collective, unspoken agreement to forget. And yet, the story persists, not in official histories, but in the realm of local legend. It is said that on hot, humid summer nights, the window of the old master bedroom, a room that has been sealed for over a century, can sometimes be seen standing wide open. A faint, inexplicable light is said to emanate from within, falling upon the section of wall where the hidden portrait once lay. It is as if the past itself refuses to be fully silenced, as if the spirit of Amelia Hollingsworth is still there, demanding that her truth and her love finally be seen. The stories we tell ourselves about the past are often built upon a foundation of silence. The most important truths are those that have been deliberately buried. Here at Before the Store, we believe that exhuming these stories is a sacred duty. The case of Amelia Hollingsworth reminds us that history is not a settled record. It is an ongoing investigation. If you believe that confronting these dark, forgotten truths is essential, then you have found your community. Subscribe now and join us in the archives, where every document is a potential key and every silence is waiting to be broken. The next story is already waiting.